Hi, good evening. My name is Thijs Lecomte. This is Robbe van Daelem. And we're going to be presenting the session on how to architect a SOC on top of Defender XDR and Microsoft Sentinel. So my name is Thijs. I am a Microsoft security consultant working for The Collective, and within my role, I'm the head of the managed services, which the main focus is our security operations center. So day in and day out, I am busy with managing our SOC for our customers and making sure we have a well-architected, secure SOC, which has a good coverage of the entire environment of our customers. Besides that, I'm also a security MVP with a strong focus on the SOAR component within the Microsoft Cloud. So I'm also a discussion leader on SOAR within the Customer Connection Program. And besides that, you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and my blog 365 by Thijs.
So my name is Robbe van Daelem. I'm a security consultant and SOC analyst at the Collective Consulting as well. I'm mainly focused on the MITRE ATT&CK framework and Microsoft security. My socials are mainly on LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, and I'm a blogger at hyperbrothers.com. So what are we going to cover? First of all, we are going to cover some architectures you can use to architect Defender XDR and Microsoft Sentinel. We're going to talk about multi-tenant authentication, automated deployments and exclusion management. Following, we're going to cover detection engineering, data collection, playbook and automation, and case management. So first of all, architecture. How do you start building your own SOC? The first architecture we will be talking about are single tenant architectures. These are the architectures where you have one single Microsoft tenant, and in most cases, one single Microsoft Sentinel log analytics workspace as well. And here you can see an example of how that works with your ITSM tool, automations, etc. Another architecture we will be talking about are the multi-tenant architectures, where you have multiple Office 365 tenants or multiple Microsoft Sentinel workspaces, how you can connect those and how you can authenticate to those workspaces, for example. Multi-tenant workspaces. So why would you create a multi-tenant workspace? The first reason is regulatory compliance. So when you, for example, have some regulatory compliance that says that data should be inside some kind of region, but you have multiple regions, then you might need to create multiple workspaces and create a multi-tenant setup. The second reason might be data ownership. So if you, for example, have strict boundaries or strict distinctions between certain sub-companies, then you might want to create certain or multiple Microsoft Sentinel instances, for example. Or when you have multiple tenants, like for example, you're an MSSP, you have multiple customers, and you need to create a SOC on top of those multiple customers, then you of course want to create multiple tenants or multiple Microsoft Sentinel workspaces for the tenants. So a couple of best practices for creating a multi-workspace setup. The first one is an MSSP should always deploy workspaces for each customer and the customer's tenant. That makes sure that you have that data boundary, what we talked about. The second one is keep the architecture as simple as possible. For what I mean by that is if you don't need to create a multi-tenant setup, keep it simple and keep it at a single tenant setup. Then the third one is make sure you have a central management system. Thijs will talk about that in a couple of minutes. But once you have a multi-workspace setup, it's important that you can manage everything centrally. How do you manage a multi-workspace setup? These are some examples. So for example, you have multiple Microsoft Sentinel workspaces. In the Microsoft Sentinel Blade, you have a multi-workspace incident view. And with this incident view, you can check the incidents for all or certain Microsoft Sentinel workspaces all at once. Querying multi-workspace setups is you can do that via the workspace expression with a union operator. So via this way, you can query multiple workspaces in one KQL query. You can use this expression in analytic rules if you want to. We don't recommend it for MSSPs though. You can do 20 workspaces at the maximum, but at the Microsoft documentation, you can see that Microsoft actually recommends maximum of 5. Good for investigations, threat hunting, and workbooks. This is kind of the conclusion. So if you want to use this, do it for investigations and threat hunting or dashboards, but we don't really recommend it for analytical creations. You also have the multi-workspace manager. This is a feature in Microsoft Sentinel where you can create multiple architectures, like you can see at the right-hand side, where you can deploy your analytic rules centrally and make them deploy to other workspaces. You can do that. We'll talk about it in a bit. For MSSP, we recommend using Azure DevOps instead. The question we would get asked a lot is, how do you protect your intellectual property as an MSSP? So there are kind of 3 options you can do for this. The first one is hosting your content in the MSSP tenant. So that means that the data for your customers is in their own Microsoft Sentinel workspace, but the analytic rules, workbooks, etc. are hosted in the MSSP tenant. The second one is restricting content in the customer tenant. So you set your content in the customer tenant, but you don't give the customer access to the Microsoft Sentinel workspace. It's something you can do, but it can always be circumvented by the user access administrator role. And the third one is actually the one we use, and that's contractual agreements. This way you have full transparency to your customers, and you can protect your intellectual property using contractual agreements. So what are the benefits of the different solutions? So the first one, hosting content. Here, incidents and alerts are not created in the customer tenant, which is not very transparent, of course. There is no customer transparency. This setup is pretty complex sometimes, but it is a good protective control. The second one is restricting access. So incident and alerts are in the customer tenant, which is good, but there isn't a lot of transparency again. Straightforward setup, it depends. Restricting access is not that hard, but sometimes it's hard to keep track of it. It's a protective control, but know that a customer can circumvent it. Then contractual agreements, incidents and alerts are all in the customer's tenant. There is customer transparency, and it's straightforward. It's not a real protective control from a technical standpoint, but if you have good contracts, that should be fine. And this is what we use at the collective as well. The second thing I wanted to talk about was authentication for multi-tenant setups. How do you do the authentication part? So there are 4 main options. First, you have GDAP, then you have Lighthouse, or you can invite your external users as guest users, or you can give everyone a named account into the customer's tenant. So the first one, GDAP, are the user objects, the first question is, are the user objects in the customer's tenant? For GDAP, this isn't the case. The user objects are in the MSSP tenant. Authentication properties are those in the customer's tenant. This is again not for GDAP. Are general roles supported? Well, yes, in terms of Entra ID roles, but GDAP currently doesn't support the Defender custom roles, for example. Are you using admin accounts with GDAP? Yeah, you can, of course. And does the customer has access control? Well, no. Once the MSSP decides to add extra people to the GDAP relationship, they can perfectly do that. With Lighthouse, it's kind of the same for the first two. So the user object is not in the customer tenant and the authentication properties aren't as well. Are granular roles supported for Azure? Yes. You can use admin accounts, but again, the customer doesn't have much access control on their side. For guest users, the user object does exist in the customer tenant, but the authentication properties again don't. Granular roles are supported, which is good, but in practice, we see that a lot of guest users are actually the day-to-day accounts of the users and not really admin accounts. So that's something to be aware of. Then the last one, customer has access control. Yes, since the object lives in the customer tenant, the customer also has a lot of access control on what those guest users can do. Then the fourth option is the option which has yes to everything. So the customer has full control over the named accounts. The authentication properties are in the tenant. You have all the roles you can assign to it if you want. You can perfectly create admin accounts, create different policies for them, and so on. So this is kind of a trade-off now, right? If you imagine an MSSP prefers to use GDAP and Lighthouse for management purposes, where they can manage a lot of customers with one account, which is very convenient. But as a customer, you maybe want to push for named accounts because you then have the most control of them. The authentication properties are in your tenant. You can do better access control, etc. So this is kind of a discussion you will need to have between an MSSP and a customer.
So Robbe already touched on some automated deployment mechanisms. I'll dive into this a little bit deeper to showcase what are the options and why do we recommend it. So first of all, is there a need for automated deployments? Well, we see three main needs. One of them is to reduce manual effort, which means just you don't want to do things the same over and over again. You just want to do it once and replicate it across all of your customers, your test environments, etc. Additionally, of course, the 4I's principle, which I think might be the most important one. It means that in those critical applications, such as a SIEM, an analyst or an engineer should not be the one deciding when a change is happening. There should be at least two people going over a change. So with DevOps, we can approve a change before it goes through the pipeline, which is really important in terms of an auditing and double-checking perspective. And then last but not least, we also have automatic validation, meaning we can run tests on top of our analytic rules or automation rules as well to ensure that they hold our naming conventions or our standard configurations. And this is not automatically, so you don't need a manual vetting process of this. You can depend on the automatic vetting process. So if we take it a step further, Robbe already touched upon that we have three different options to do automated deployment. First of all, we have Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps is the one which has already been there. We use Azure DevOps as an example, but it could be any CI/CD tool like GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever have you. Sentinel repositories is a native function. You could say it is Azure DevOps, but natively integrated. And in Workspace Manager, Robbe already touched upon it. It is a way to manage multiple workspaces without the overhead of a CI/CD pipeline. So for Azure DevOps, it is not a native implementation, but there's so many templates available. And it supports a lot of things. So it supports automated deployment, customization of the pipelines, of the deployment mechanism. You can implement the 4I's principle using approvals and also automatic validation. Some people are holding back by Azure DevOps because of the complexity, and that's why Microsoft introduced Sentinel repositories, which kind of automates the process. So that's all the things that Azure DevOps does, but it's a native implementation, doesn't require you to know DevOps or code, but there are some limitations, mainly in the automatic validation setup, because it's something you need to add manually. There's no native support for that. And then last but not least, Workspace Manager. Workspace Manager doesn't really hold CI/CD automatic deployment. It's just a way of managing multiple tenants. So it's not something we recommend because the advantages of CI/CD are not in there. We typically recommend customers to go with Azure DevOps just because of the customization and so many templates being available. The step in might be a little bit bigger, but in the end, we see a lot of companies hitting the limitations of central repositories. So that's why we prefer Azure DevOps. A discussion we often have with customers and internally as well is ARM versus DevOps. I am more inclined to use ARM, while Robbe is more inclined to use Bicep. ARM versus Bicep, not DevOps, sorry. So ARM is the older version of templates, while Bicep is the newer version of templates. To us, it really depends on a personal choice. Why we are still using ARM internally, for example, is just because of the ease of exporting and the integration in some of the templates. All of the templates within the GitHub page are ARM templates. And if you export something from the Sentinel GUI into a template, it's also ARM. So that's why we decided to still remain on ARM, just because of the ease of use. So what is support in terms of CI/CD? Well, there we depend a lot on the API availabilities. Everything Sentinel related is supported because Sentinel is based on the Azure Management API. So everything you can do in the portal, you can do it through API. The one thing I want to discuss is data connectors. Yes, they can be done through CI/CD, but the main disadvantage is that connecting a data connector like Entra ID requires security administrator, which are pretty highly privileged roles. And you want to be careful adding those to the pipeline. Recently, there was a Graph API update supporting Defender XDR custom detections, which is a really good thing. But what we're really lacking is all of the other Defender resources, such as alert tuning, alert suppression, Defender for identity exclusions. Those are all not supported by the API, which means we have some limitations on what we can push through CI/CD. How does it look like on what we have in the collective? Well, first of all, we have a way to have generic templates for all of our customers, and we have a specific repository for a specific customer. This is also detailed in this slide, where you can see the generic repo and the customer-specific repo. And we also allow overriding, which I feel is really important because it allows you to have a generic rule, but provide an update, a specific exclusion, or disable the rule if the customer is not suitable for the specific rule. Additionally, we specify different data connectors in our Azure DevOps, so we can dynamically push the content for a specific data connector, because it is important if a customer doesn't have a specific table enabled. For example, FortiGate logs and the common security log, you cannot push data connectors using that table, and that will fail. Additionally, it's also important to think about the timing of deployments, because what happens if you have an analytic rule which runs daily, every 24 hours, it will run on a schedule the moment it deploys, and then 24 hours after, 24 hours after. But if you do a redeployment using Azure DevOps, you will face the issue that it runs immediately at time of redeployment. Meaning if you deploy, for example, 2-3 times in 24 hours, the rule will run 2-3 times, and you will have duplicate incidents. So that's why it's important to think about that. And for example, think, do you want to deploy everything in DevOps or only deploy changes? There is a native integration within central repositories to only deploy changes. I'm not a fan of that because I like to have CI/CD as a single source of truth, and you can only do that if you push everything at once. So once we have deployed everything, of course, exclusion management comes in. What is exclusion management and why do we need it? With exclusion management, I mean the process of adding and managing, updating exclusions. Why do we need exclusions? Well, for me, it's twofold. One of them is to decrease the amount of false positives and benign positives we have. That's good for the SOC because then they are happy because they don't deal with alert fatigue. But also really important, avoiding negative impact. A false positive can have impact on a user or a device. For example, if there is an alert on Defender, it could be that an application is blocked. Well, we shouldn't want it to be blocked. So we really want to avoid business impact. So that's why exclusions are really important. The issue is that within Sentinel and XDR as a whole, there's multiple ways to add exclusions in multiple places. So we have directly ND analytic rule, using Sentinel automation rules, alert tuning, indicators, and MDI exclusions. There are 5 options available, which I have listed, and you really need to think about what is the best way for you and what works for you. So what do? We have an exclusion register to centrally manage all of the exclusions we have. That's for me really important because I want to know at each time which customer has which exclusion, so that they have insights and also we can review them. And additionally, maybe the most important thing, that exclusion should have a reasoning why an exclusion has been added, so we can go back and check, is this something we want, yes or no? Then additionally, ideally we want the customer notice or an approval if an exclusion is added, so it's really transparent on the process. That approval can also happen using a CI/CD integration, using Azure DevOps, so the customer is aware of all of the exclusions. And last but not least, I always say when you're creating incidents, when you're creating exclusions, try to avoid incident creation. There is a way to avoid the incident, for example, by updating KQL, so that the incident is never created, or you could use something like an automation rule to avoid to create the incident and automatically close it. I'm not a fan of automatically closing the incident immediately, just because the reporting numbers you're doing then, the amount of incidents being generated, etc., are not showing what is really happening, what investigations are being done. So I try to avoid creating incidents as a whole. How does this look like? Well, I created a small flow, a small decision tree on what we do internally. First of all, we check, can we update the rule in KQL? If this is possible, this means, okay, great. We will define it in the KQL. That's for us the most important part, because then we can do it using CI/CD, pushing analytic rules. There is a proof of flow, and we avoid the incidents being created. If we cannot update it using KQL, we look into, are the required entities in Sentinel available? Because not all entities are available sometimes, and it might be that there are specific entities really detailed, which are only available in the Defender alert tuning, not in Sentinel. But if it is available, I do it using automation rules. Why is that? Because automation rules has native integration into CI/CD. Only if there's no automation rule possible, we will divert into a product-specific exclusion, like, for example, alert tuning. Here we also have a discussion. You want to create the exclusion specific enough. You don't want to create exclusions which are too broad, meaning that's why it's important to check what entities do you require to create the exclusion. And only if you have the required entities to create the exclusion, I would pivot to automation rules. Otherwise, use an alert tuning. Yes, it's not integrated into CI/CD. There's no API available, but it does allow you to go really deep into an exclusion. Of course, before we should create exclusions, we need to stay on top of things by creating detection engineering. Rob will now deep dive into the process and some do's and don'ts.
Yes, detection engineering. So why would you do detection engineering? So the first reason is to close gaps in your detection mechanisms, of course. You can rely on default tools such as Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Office 365. But in some cases, it might be interesting to create your own rules for very specific scenarios that you want to cover. The second one is to reduce dwell time. The more detections you have, the more reasons or points of detections you have, which might reduce the dwell time after an incident occurs. And the third one is detect advanced adversaries. Once you start battling those advanced adversaries, they know how to evade a lot of things, for example, an EDR solution. So then you will need extra detections for specific defensive agent techniques, for example, to spot those advanced adversaries. How do you do detection engineering? So, and this is kind of a controversial way of doing or of looking at it, but this is my way. First way of doing it is building detection rules, of course. The second way is adding more tools or data sources to your SIEM. And it's not because you're adding tools or data to your SIEM that your detection posture goes up, but without adding extra data, you cannot detect certain things, of course. And then the third one is changing your data logic. And I will go over that in a minute. So detection engineering, what can we spot with creating extra detection rules? So for example, you want to spot a suspected threat, so a very specific threat. The second reason might be you want to do anomaly detection, Or the third one is you want to detect a very specific item of interest. Examples of these are for suspected threat, C2 communication, for example. You want to detect C2 communication. Anomalies might be usage of unusual TLDs, for example, so not a real threat, but something that might be very suspicious. And then the third example is, for example, the DNS lookups of malware domains, which is a very specific thing or case you want to detect. And the second point I mentioned was adding tools or data. This is an example of how you can do that. So let's say you have, for example, 3 servers in your on-premise domain. You have 2 servers onboarded in Defender for Endpoint, which means that you have logs of those 2 servers because they are onboarded in Defender for Endpoint. But let's say that the third one is a legacy device or a device that isn't supported by Defender for Endpoint. Then you will need another source before you can have those data in your Microsoft Sentinel workspace. To do that, you might, for example, use a firewall to capture the data you need, since you cannot use Defender for Endpoint, for example. So this is what we mean by sometimes you have to add tools before you can create your detection coverage better. A second example of this specific adding tools is, let's say that your servers are all Defender for Endpoint onboarded. Via Defender for Endpoint, you have, for example, layer 4 network traffic in the device network events table of Defender XDR. But let's say that you want to have layer 7 network packet inspection. That's something that Defender for Endpoint does a bit, but not very much. So for that, you might need the firewall again. And this is an example of how another source is important if you want to detect certain things. In the third example, I want to talk about changing your data collection logic. So let's say that you integrated your firewall into Microsoft Sentinel. There are a lot of different types of that firewall, which you might want to adjust. Let's say that you, for example, first want to focus on layer 7 network events, so alert rules of the firewall itself. Then if you want to extend your detection coverage, you might need layer 4 network traffic, so you can create your own specific detections. Another example is, let's say that you want to know brute force attacks on the SSL VPN, then you are still using the same firewall as a detection source, but you need to add other data to make sure that you can detect those SSL VPN brute forces. So where do I start? Well, first of all, start with identifying your crown jewels and evaluate the data value or detection value. An example of that is, for example, ESXi hosts. It's always an example I like to use. Of course, your ESXi hosts or your hypervisor are your crown jewels and are very important. But from a detection point of view, it is sometimes hard to detect specific threats on those. So you might not want to start with those specific data sources because there isn't a lot of detection value into that. Otherwise, you will blow up your SIEM, have a lot of costs without a lot of detection improvements. The second one is search for interesting capture points. So, for example, what I mentioned is use Defender for Endpoint for most of your devices, but for the legacy devices, you might need a firewall, for example. And the third one is start with a basic but diverse coverage. This is kind of the thought of not putting all your eggs into one basket. So make sure that you have different detections on different layers of your security posture and make sure that they're all basic good. And once you have that, you can start with expanding specific layers, for example, expanding the EDR or your firewall detections, etc. So how do you do detection gap analysis in Microsoft Sentinel? there is a blade called SOC optimization. And this is a blade which you can find in Microsoft Sentinel and shows you where you can improve your detection coverage on. If you go into recommendation, you see a nice graph of the MITRE tactics, which you can improve on. You can click through to the whole matrix with the techniques as well. And if you go to the Content Hub, they actually tell you which content you need to improve your detection coverage. So this is a nice feature if you want to start with your detection gap analysis. If you want to do it advanced, I would recommend using the MITRE framework, where you first create a mapping of your relevant techniques you want to cover, and then do an overlay of your detection coverage. And this is the layer you then kind of get, where you can see the red cells are techniques that aren't covered, the green cells are techniques that you do cover, and the brighter the color, the more important the technique is. So this is an example of using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to make sure and know what to prioritize first. Detection engineering responsibilities, how do we do it at our SOC? So the first one is building detection rules. This is typically something for the traditional detection engineer who builds the KQLs really. And then adding more tools and data sources or changing data collection logic of those tools is typically something that a SOC engineer does most of the time in more like a consultancy way. There we check with the customer for their environment what would be best to ingest into Sentinel, and then decide on what data we are going to send to Sentinel based on the detections or the gaps we want to fill in. Data collection. So we talked about detection engineering, adding extra data to Microsoft Sentinel, but how do you add that data to Microsoft Sentinel? So for us, there are 4 main ways of doing that. The first one is you use agents. So you install an agent on a server device and get data from that device via the agent and put it into Microsoft Sentinel. The second way of doing it is using forwarders. So let's say that you have a firewall and you cannot install an agent on that, then you need to configure a forwarder, a syslogs forwarder, for example, sends the data from the firewall to the forwarder, and then the forwarder sends it to Microsoft Sentinel. The third one is using the codeless connector platform of Microsoft Sentinel, where you can integrate with already existing APIs of your source, or you create your own API integration, where you can create an Azure Logic app or maybe an Azure function, create an API, and then send the data from your source to your own created API integration that you made. So first of all, the agents. There are 4 main agents you can use. So the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, Defender for Endpoint, the Azure Monitoring Agent, and Sysmon. The Microsoft Monitoring Agent is legacy. It was deprecated in August 2024 already. Had less flexibility, no data transformations, connects directly to an log analytics workspace. It's legacy, so I won't recommend to use it anymore. The second one is Defender for Endpoint. So you can actually use Defender for Endpoint, and you have already a lot of data with Defender for Endpoint if you want to. There is less flexibility in terms of if you want to have extra data. It's kind of hard to accomplish with Defender for Endpoint. But it is an easy deployment, no data transformations, and it connects to Defender XDR. The third reason or agent is the Azure Monitor Agent. With that, you have far more flexibility. You can create data transformations as much as you want with data collection rules in Azure, but you need Azure Arc for that. And then the fourth agent is Sysmon. You have a lot of flexibility with Sysmon. You still need an MMA or AMA agent to get the Sysmon logs, but it's very good for edge cases and for very specific scenarios that you want to use. What do we do at the collective? Most of all, we start with Defender for Endpoint as our basis. And then if we want to have extra logs, we use the Azure Monitor agent to get extra Windows event logs, for example, and create detections on top of that. So forwarders, I talked about forwarders. What if you cannot install an agent on your device? Then you can use a forwarder to send it for you to Microsoft Sentinel. Forwarders are used for network appliances, hypervisors, etc. So these are the main use cases where we use it for. There are a lot of protocols. Some forwarders can support like syslog, beats, log4j, SNMP, etc. Although syslog will be the most used in practice. And then it's mainly used for on-premise scenarios like firewalls and network appliances. There are two agents we like to use for the Azure Monitor agent, forwarders, sorry. The first one is the Azure Monitor agent. It's easier than Logstash. The second one is Logstash. You can do normalization and transformations of your data with the Azure Monitor agent using data collection rules in Azure. Logstash, though, has local filtering, which is very easy to use with the Logstash pipelines. You also have data collection rule support in Azure if you want to. So you can even do your transformations in Azure. You can run it in containers. There are a variety of input plugins, and you don't need an ARC onboarding with Logstash. The third one is the codeless connector platform we talked about. So this is building a data connector in Microsoft Sentinel by pulling your data from your source. The second screenshot is the codeless connector builder. So it's a really nice workbook which I recommend because sometimes it's very hard to create such a codeless connector. But using this workbook, it gets much easier. Then the last option is creating your own API. So creating your own API integration. There are two ways, so via workspace ID and key. This is the old way of doing it, or you do it via the log ingestion API. I would recommend doing it via the log ingestion API because then you can use data collection rules and data collection endpoints in Azure and do a lot of transformations with your data and filtering if you need to. When do you use the API integration? Yeah, when the source does not have a polling API. If the source has a polling API, then I would recommend the codeless connector platform. So when you want to really push your data from your data source to the scene. There's a lot of freedom in integration technologies you can use. Like I said earlier, you can use Logic Apps, Azure Functions, or whatever you want. So it's just creating your own API at the end. I also created a decision tree of how we decide which way we are going to integrate data into Microsoft Sentinel. So the first one, or the first question you need to ask yourself is there a connector available? And of course, is it a good connector? If it is a good connector, then you just use the existing connector that already exists. If one of the two questions is no, then the second question you need to ask yourself is the source an on-premise device? If it is, then the second question is, do you need complex transformations? So do you need a lot of filtering? Do you need a lot of normalization logic? Do you need to run it in a container, etc.? Then I would recommend using Logstash as a forwarder. If you don't need a lot of transformations or it is a pretty easy setup you want to do, I would recommend the Azure Monitor agent because it's much simpler to set up. If it isn't an on-premise device, then this question is there a polling API? If there is, then you can use the codeless connector platform to get the data. If there isn't a polling API for a data source, then you need a custom API integration to send the data to Microsoft Sentinel. This is an overview of different data sources integrated with Microsoft Sentinel. So at the left-hand side, we have, for example, Defender for Identity. This is a native connector, so we just use the native connector. Then you have another set of on-premise network appliances. On these you cannot install an agent, so we use Logstash as a syslog forwarder. And then at the top, you have a couple of cloud solutions. You have Dynamics, which is a native connector again, so we use the native. Then you have Kato Networks, which has a polling API, so we create a codeless connector platform for that. And then the other sources like Cortex and Rubrix don't have a polling API, so for those you will need to send the data to Sentinel either via a workspace key, more the legacy way, or via the log ingestion API, just like Rubrix does. These will talk about playbooks and automations.
All right, so if you implement all of the data, you'll have tons of data, too much to try to figure out. So you need some automation to try to make your life a little bit easier, a little more efficient. So what is at the center of automation within Microsoft Sentinel? It's playbooks. Playbooks is just a Azure Logic app in context of Microsoft Sentinel. So if you don't know Azure Logic apps, it's pretty much the same as Power Automate or Flow, but based on the Azure platform. So it's just a resource you deploy within Azure. There's a couple of automation use cases. One is we have synchronization, notification of incidents. If you receive a new incident in Sentinel, you might want to sync it to your ITSM tool. Additionally, we have enrichment. Enrichment means we have the existing incident. We want to add more details. This could be like enrichment about the IP address, the user, history of the user, history of the device, just adding more context so the analyst has an immediate view on what's going on. And last but not least, maybe the most important part is actions, meaning remediation actions, mitigations. This could be password reset and device isolation. I think those are the most two common ones, but we also have action on top of firewalls to block certain IPs or to retrieve PCAP files. You can go as Poco Loco if you want. So what for me the goal is in terms of MSSPs and playbooks, it's to have a uniform way to reset a password independent of the customer's willingness or trust in automation. What do I mean by that? If there is a SOC analyst working on multiple customers, it's really difficult for him to know, oh, customer Y, I can do it manually. For customer Z, I need a approval flow, so I'll create an email. And for another customer, I can do it for everything but a certain set of users like the VIPs. This is really difficult for them to manage and to remember, and then human mistakes will just happen. So what we do is we heavily rely on parameters. So we have a single logic app which we deploy through all of our customers for every one of our actions, and we have parameters configuring the exclusions, the notifications, and the actions. So we can say per customer, hey, let's do full automation, or we don't do any automation, but instead of an automation, if we don't do an automation, we'll just send an email, hey, dear customer, please reset the password of user X to make sure that this button still works. It still has the same effect. Password reset will be triggered, but it could be manually by the customer or using automation. It will get tricky and it will get a lot of information. This is an example of how vast a logic app can become and how complex it can be. I think this is the password reset flow we created. And that's also why there is a disadvantage of logic apps, and it's mainly to do with loops, with for each loops, and just complex objects and arrays. And that's why we do see use cases for Azure Functions. The issue is that there is no native functionality in Sentinel to trigger an Azure function. So you need to trigger the logic app, which will then trigger the Azure function, which will execute the change. It's not ideal, but we see so many times that there is just a too complex way to do it in logic apps. So don't be hesitant to switch it to Azure Functions if it's just way easier to write it in PowerShell. Don't make logic apps too complex. Final topic is case management. Within case management, we mean handling the incidents. We have three different ways or options to handle incidents. We can do it natively in Microsoft Sentinel. We can use our custom ITSM tool, or we can use a third-party SOAR. Third-party SOAR could be like Palo Alto XSOAR, but there's lots of different availabilities. Sentinel in itself is also a SOAR system, so that's why we can also use Sentinel for the SOAR and case management capabilities. The issue in Sentinel is we really have lots of limitations in terms of customization. We cannot change any fields, we cannot update any statuses. Managing SLAs is really tricky, and there's also no way to split up, for example, multiple queues. To have a queue for first line and for second line. We could do it using workbooks, but it's a little bit hesitant. It's not really something I like. So Sentinel, doing case management in Sentinel is something I would never recommend, actually. Second option is to use an ITSM tool. All of our customers or all of your customers will have an ITSM tool available. The easiest thing is it will integrate into other business processes, but the main issue is it lacks adequate SOAR capabilities. An ITSM tool is not a SOAR, so automation is not available. That's why we can go into a third-party SOAR. The good thing is it's really feature-rich. There is a really strong investigation experience. It's so much better and mature compared to Sentinel. For example, I had a demo of D3 security lately, and the amount of features it has, it's amazing to compare it to Sentinel. But the issue with it comes at an additional price because you need to pay that third-party SOAR, and also the automation is not done inside of Sentinel. You pull it outside of your SOAR. So what do we do in the collective? Well, we use Jira Cloud. That's our ITSM tool, which we use for other services, for customer interactions, and for business processes. But we have heavily customized it to fit with SOC investigations to make sure that we can do everything we need to do from a SOC perspective. We build a custom sync engine to synchronize Jira Cloud to Sentinel in a bi-directional way. And that is also available in the Content Hub beneath Jira. One of the main advantages why we also, for example, keep with Jira and other third-party SOAR is because we feel that having the automation in the customer tenants using logic apps means the authentication is fully in the customer and they have full visibility on everything happening there. And that is a really big advantage for us, is that the customer knows what is happening, knows where the permissions are there, because otherwise our third-party SOAR would be really overly permissive. So that's been a quick 15 minutes, and we talked about a ton of things, and building a Sentinel, building a SIEM or a SOC on top of Defender and Sentinel takes a lot of things. So we want to close off with 4 important things to remember. One of them is the complexity. Building a SOC is not easy. Sometimes we see customers saying, I deployed Sentinel, I will create a SOC and I will sell it to all of my customers as an MSSP. It's easy, but it comes with some complexity, and we need to think about how do we build a SOC, maintain it, automate it, do detection engineering, do it well. Doing a SOC well takes a lot of effort. Additionally, doing things the right way takes a lot of effort. We try to be as native as possible, as least privileged as possible, which is the good thing to do, but it doesn't make it easy. It's not the easiest way, but if you do it the right way, you will find customers really appreciate it, you doing it securely and natively, because they have the main advantage of that. So that's also why we say leverage them build. Try to use what is possible in Sentinel. Sentinel is not perfect, Defender is not perfect, but they have a lot of native capabilities which you can use to go forward. And last but not least, it's a personal approach. We cannot say this is how you should build a SIEM. I think it's really good that you tweak the SOC to your liking and also to the requirements of your SOC analyst and your customers, because it's best to do it on a personal way. Then you also have a tailored approach which really works and people know what is going on. So we discussed a ton during this presentation. We hope you found it insightful. We hope you learned a lot on how you can build a SOC and manage it. We will also be available, for example, through social media. If you ever want to reach out and have a question, feel free to send a question to both Robbe and me. Thank you all.